And what I want to do is give you an overview into debates about social class. So this isn't going to be about policy particularly, it's going to be about one of the major concepts we've used in the social sciences to make sense of inequality over many, many decades. And I want to kind of pose the question that the concept of class needs to be a really important feature of the way we think about inequality, but it also needs to be updated and rethought in the context of how the world is changing massively in the 21st century. So this slide here shows a number of books which have transformed the social sciences in the last decade or so. And they have done so by emphasizing that we live in a world with massive amounts of economic inequality, and that those economic inequalities are having a huge impact on our societies and on the fabric of social life. The book at the top left here by Thomas Piketty is a really dense 1,000-page hardback, and it sold 2 million copies across the world, which is amazing to see it has that resonance. So I'm a sociologist, I'm not an economist, I'm a sociologist, and I want to try and relate some of this work to understanding what social class means these days. I want to do that too, by also emphasizing that the social world can't easily be cut into little bits. So race, gender, and other kinds of inequalities need to be brought in to that conception of social class. And we therefore need to kind of be very deft in the way we work across disciplines to put social class at the top of our understanding. So I'm going to begin. I've only got 20 minutes. I'm going to break this into 3 sections, about 5 minutes each. I want to begin quickly with the way economists have shown the issues around sociological models of class. And I haven't got much time, so I'll be very brief. But sociologists have normally in the past used conceptions of class which draw on Karl Marx and Max Weber and other traditions, and they really emphasize the centrality of divide between the working class, the proletariat, and the middle classes. So they really see society as being divided into a few big classes. It's not a very focused approach. It's quite a basic and crude approach. Class is some kind of big categorical variable. And the way that class is often measured from within this perspective is around the use of occupations and employment. The most famous model of this kind is that developed by the sociologist John Goldthorpe. And this is the model which is used by the UK government, the Office of National Statistics, and it underpins the official class schema we use today in the UK. And really what it does is it classifies people to a social class according to your job and employment situation. And I put in this graph a red line to indicate the 3 major classes. So classes 1 and 2, professionals and managers. Classes 3 to 5 are sort of intermediate class, and class 6 to 7 are the manual routine workers. So although this is a very clever and subtle schema, and you can go into much more detail once you unpick these different classes, it basically says class is to do with your occupation and your employment. Now, what are the problems with that approach? And I've written a lot about this over the years, and I have had some great arguments with John Goldthorpe and other people who work in this tradition. It's a great tradition of work, but it's still focused upon the idea that there is a kind of old-fashioned working class. Manual workers still form, or routine workers, to use the contemporary language, still are a key social class. This is a model of class developed at a time when industrial capitalism and factory workers, male factory workers, were the bedrock of the labour market. But that's no longer the case. Today in the UK, around 10% of people are in manual work. Manual work is not a major part of the labour market. And it's also the case that this model of class was developed at a time when the working class was seen to be politically active, formed trade unions, supported the Labour Party, and there was a strong social democratic Labour politics. Well, certainly for those of you in Scotland, when you look at the weakness of the Labour Party now in Scotland, that all seems a bit dated. And we saw very interesting, the last election, 2019 UK election, working class people are more likely to vote Conservative than Labour for the first time ever. So that model we have of the working class as a kind of key social class, really, it doesn't really live with the reality of contemporary life. It also is a model of class assuming that the male worker, the white male worker, the male white industrial worker, is the kind of litmus test, the bedrock of class. But of course, that's not true. Never was true. It's certainly not true now. It tends towards an approach whereby we can cut up different nations and talk about different class structures in them as if nations are separate entities. And my main point is it doesn't allow us to understand the pulling away at the top levels of the labour market and the income structure. And this is exactly the point which the economists have emphasised. So this very famous book by Thomas Piketty, which came out 6 years ago, Capital in the 21st Century, long book, lots of graphs, but the main feature of his argument is captured by this diagram here. And what he does in this diagram is he traces the share of total national income taken by the top 10% of earners, the best paid earners in these 4 countries, US, Britain, Canada, and Australia. And the point is a simple one, but it's a really important one, which is that from 1910 to around 1980, that top 10% were taking a smaller proportion of the national income. That is to say, those societies were becoming more equal. However, since the 80s, in all these countries, the top 10% have pulled away from the rest. They're taking a higher proportion of total national income. And that's clearly meaning that it's particular top levels of the class structure which have done particularly well. Now, this struck a chord with me because it was exactly what we argued was the case in the Great British Class Survey, which we did with the BBC 7 or 8 years ago. You can still search online for YouTube clips if you're interested. 1/3 people did a huge web survey on social class. And what we try to say is, let's just forget about class as to do with your occupation for the moment. Let's see class as multidimensional. Let's see it as linked to different kinds of capital, different kinds of assets. And following Pierre Bourdieu, a very influential French sociologist, we saw the 3 main assets being economic, your income, your savings, your property value; cultural capital, your educational qualifications, your ability to command and use expertise; and your social networks, the old boys club, who you know. So we got measures of all these 3 questions, and we just clustered together the main responses to see what the main patterns were which discriminated amongst the UK population. Now, there's a big discussion about this approach to class, which I haven't got time to go into. I'm going to go straight to the headline findings, which are captured by these graphics which the BBC used when they launched the study 7 or 8 years ago. Basic argument is there's 7 classes. That's not so different from Goldthorpe, actually. But the point which is really important is that at the top we have a small class of a few percent who are elite. And what makes them elite is simply that they are so much better off than anybody else. They're better off than the large number of people who are working in the established middle class, which is, your if you like, your normal professional people, your normal university-educated professional people. So even among what Goldthorpe calls the service class, you're finding increasing division at the top. Then also at the bottom, there's a group which we call the precariat, who were just so much worse off than any other class, and they were worse off than other members of what you might call the working class. So the point really is, I'm not going to go into details, it doesn't matter for these purposes. What matters is to say the class structure is being pulled apart, top and the bottom, and the big boundary which is fundamental to much sociological thinking between the middle and the working class, is no longer so important, because in the middle it's more fragmented and less clearly differentiated. And what comes out of our study time and again, and we have lots of discussions about this in the book we wrote, is what we call what is often called top-end effect. That is to say, certain processes seem to really differ at the margins amongst people who are just very different because they earn so much more money. So here's one example. There are many examples. Here's one example. We asked the question, do you know a chief executive, a shop assistant, a factory worker, or an aristocrat? And this chart differentiates the number of people saying they know one of those people according to how much money they earn. And if you look particularly at the yellow line, do you know an aristocrat? Well, as you'd expect, not many people do. It's still an overestimate, mind you. I mean, but anyway, it's about 10% of people know an aristocrat, so they claim. And it doesn't go, it goes up a bit as you earn more money. You earn £100,000, it's a bit more. But then when you suddenly get to around £150,000, which is really into the top 1% of the population now, we're really amongst the top earners, it's suddenly that yellow line suddenly takes off. And the same is true to a lesser extent for the people saying they know a chief executive. So what we are seeing is effects which are very concentrated and very different at the top end of the income and class distribution. I'm going to skip over that. So we argued on the basis of this work that really what we need to use to think about class isn't a model based upon occupation and employment. I mean, that is important, don't get me wrong, but we're better off thinking about classes as to do with your assets, what you might call your capitals, your resources. If you do that, you can kind of differentiate, and of course it varies according to which country you're talking about, but you can differentiate a small elite who are just have so much more than anybody else. And there's also a group which Thomas Piketty calls a patrimonial middle class, who aren't massively well off, not as well off as the elite, but they still do extremely well out of the inheritance of wealth. So Piketty has this remarkable figure, which I'm not sure how he derived it from, but it's an amazing figure, I think. 16% of French people can expect to inherit 750,000 euros in their life, which is equivalent to half the average earnings. Sorry, the average earnings of the median French person. So this is really quite amazing how inheritance and the transmission of assets is really something which is not just confined to the top levels. And so you might see class in these terms today. If you use this approach, small elite at the top, at the bottom, precariat, who are just, and the precariat are not to be confused with the kind of benefit earning, unemployed. We have a kind of media stereotype about the long-term unemployed. That isn't the case. In our research, there are people who normally are employed, but that's in really badly paid and insecure employment. And then between those two extremes, there's a group of comfortably off middle classes, but there's a large group who are in the middle of that insecure middle working class who, are getting by. They're doing okay, but things could go wrong. There could be issues in their life which causes them to be much less secure. And of course, the time of COVID, these group will be experiencing all anxieties and stresses. Okay, last 5 minutes. So, as you can see, in some ways, class is becoming, more divided, and it's also differentiating between a small elite and much larger, more lumpy groups in the middle. The final point I want to make out is to really bring out the significance of wealth. Often when economists talk about inequality, they think about how much you earn, your income, and your salary, your wage. Yes, sure, that's important, very important. But one of the big trends in most societies is that people are deriving an increasing amount of their total income from capital, from their assets. Think about the resources people get from owning a house, from pension entitlements if you've got them, possibly from stocks and shares, possibly from savings. Now, those forms of wealth are massively distributed unequally, but they're an increasingly significant part of contemporary societies. Here's Piketty's famous graph on this point. He has this phrase, capital is back. There used to be an idea that the people who lived off earnings, people who lived off their savings were kind of Victorian throwbacks. So nowadays we all have to go out and work. And he's making the point, actually, we live in a society when a significant number of people don't need to work because they are living off our assets. Capital is back. And the way he measures that is in terms of what he calls the capital income ratio. That is to say, the proportion of total capital, by which he means assets of any kind, any asset you can trade, any asset you can sell, housing, property, stocks and shares, money, pension entitlement, you can't sell those, investments. The proportion of wealth or assets compared to the national income. And the point is that by 1950, that capital income ratio had fallen, but since that period, it has gone up. The amount of wealth and capital has increased compared to income in most societies, and the UK is no different. Here's an interesting slide which was produced by my colleague John Hills, comparing income inequality with wealth inequality a few years ago in the UK. So so people who get the lowest income are on the left-hand side, people who get the highest income on the right-hand side. What this tells you, to use one ratio, which is the 90-10 ratio, is that the top 10% of income earners, get about 4 times as much as the amount of money which you get if you're in the bottom 10%. So that's a big difference, but it's not a massive difference. Yes, there is a big difference between people's incomes, but a ratio of 4 to 1 between the top 10 and the bottom 10 is not massive. When you look at wealth, that's a very different picture. Because, as you can imagine, a significant number of people actually don't have no wealth at all. They're in debt. And then at the top end, the few people with a massive amount of wealth, just in a sense, even top earners, there's a ceiling to how much you can earn. But with wealth, the sky is the limit. You can carry on investing, and you can carry on living off wealth and gaining the investment potential of wealth. And so the ratio of the top 10 to the bottom 10 is now 70 to 1 if you look at wealth. I'm going to pass on that slide because I'm running out of time. It's also the case that we often think about class and we think about income as to do with something which individuals have. You're normally paid your income as an individual. But wealth, by contrast, is much more collective, based in households, families. It's more social. And it therefore recognizes that when we understand wealth inequality, and when we see wealth and assets as part of classes, we're talking about households, groupings of different kinds of adults and also children. And these kinds of conflicts between generations, conflicts of also alliances between generations, men and women, and different kinds of groups, is really fundamental to how wealth inequality is organized. So wealth, you can buy with a lot of money, with a huge income, you can buy a Porsche. If you've got the wealth, you invest in houses. There's also it's a point about intersectionality. There's a recent report by the Runnymede Trust called "The Colour of Money," very, 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 very important, because we've seen a huge significance of racial inequality in the recent coronavirus pandemic. And the Runnymede showed that the wealth gap is massive. So here, white British people, for every pound they have as wealth, Bangladeshi has 10 pence. Black African has 10 pence. That's a ratio of 10 to 1. Much bigger than the disparity in income between those groupings. And of course, the reasons for that, well, many, many reasons, but one of them is that migrant groups in particular don't have a history and the time to build up the investments and the wealth that other people do. Housing is a central part of wealth. that was actually, we'll just finish this slide quickly. Another Piketty slide. So today, if you look at the amount of wealth in Britain, look at the figure saying 2010, you can see that the grey bit is a massive part. So over half of the total amount of wealth in Britain today is tied up in housing. That didn't used to be the case. If you look back to the 1700s, much of it was based on agricultural land. Today, it's housing and owner-occupied housing and investment in housing, which is a crucial driver of wealth inequality and therefore class. It's not, well, employment is important, don't get me wrong, but it's the housing, communities and wealth is crucial. Similarly, as I was saying earlier on, as wealth increases, so does inheritance. But I'm rushing to the end because it's the end now. Just my last slide. So what have I said? I've tried to give, I've given you a cook's tour thinking about class. And the point is really to say, we need to retool class analysis to take economic capital and wealth really seriously. And what we've seen is that involves making us think about elites. It makes us think about consumption, housing, makes us recognize that wealth is tied up in housing, in families and households, in communities. And it gets us to think about neighborhoods and households rather than just your job. It gets us to think about inheritance and how things get passed down. And it gets us to realize too that we should not take too seriously the idea that, you know, we can all just achieve things if we work hard enough. It makes us realize that there's a lot of passing on and inheritance. So these themes around neighborhood, housing, consumption, I think are very relevant to the issues which the Edinburgh, well, the research team have been developing. And so I'm looking forward to hearing the talks to come. Thank you.